Express motor E1 was 60 feet in length, built in 1915 by the Preston Car and Coach Company at a cost of about $13,300. It was powered by four 125 horsepower motors. In addition to moving express baggage, the car was capable of hauling 2 or 3 light boxcars. Unfortunately, it met an untimely demise when it hit an L&PS freight motor and was scrapped in 1954.
The cars were operated in strictly railroads with the conductor and motorman. The cord that you see over the head there was what the conductor used to signal the motorman to start or to somebody to get off at the next station. Here's the line train again. If I recall correctly, it was a very cold day and the overhead got too much tension and simply snapped somewhere. Most of the stops on the line were simply unmanned open shelters. This is how they stopped the car rather than doing what they did on other lines, going waving your hands like mad. Those diagonal stripes on there are green reflective tape, which showed up at night in the light from the headlights. One of the ways that you could tell the early date of the construction of this line is that there was rather little strictly tangent track in it. There was a great deal of very, very gentle curves, and if it had been built later, they tended to put in as long tangents as they could, and then a fairly sharp curve, and then more long tangents. During the winter, when they went tearing by on run pasts and so forth, you got quite a bit of snow kicked up by the cars as they roared by. You also got very cold feet when you're standing beside the line waiting for something to happen. The L&PS is not particularly in a snow belt, and they didn't have any extraordinary problems with snow, but they did have at least one nose plow which they could push along the line with one of the freight motors if they needed to. This is the standard sign that all railroads have, one type or another. Just the legal necessity that if you get bashed by a train, then they can say, "We told you so, it's your own fault." As time went on, the financial position got worse and worse, and the city had to inject more and more capital in it to keep the line running. And finally, in 1903, they got some special legislation which meant that thereafter the city was 100% owner of the line. And they kept it, they leased it to the steam railroads up until it was electrified in 1915. The line's finances were completely ruined when the train ferry service that brought the coal from Ohio was discontinued in the early 1930s. This took away almost all their paying business, and the line was in more or less desperate financial position after that.
During the last 20 years of L&PS operation, the electric railways in North America were being abandoned. The trucking industry, with their diesel-powered vehicles, took all the light freight business away from the electric lines. Diesel locomotives were replacing steam locomotives on all railway lines. The commissioners of the L&PS decided that GM diesel locomotives would better serve the line, and they boarded a special train to demonstrate the new locomotive's capabilities. The first diesel locomotive from GM was L4, which arrived in August of 1955. L5 was a redesigned unit that was purchased in 1957.
There was a period of 9 years when there was a certain amount of electric operation combined with diesel operation. They discovered that the diesels were not so good for switching in the various freight spurs around London, so that the electrics were used on the north end of the line and the diesels were used over the whole line down to Port Stanley. The 1956 to 1965 was a time of combined operation, so to speak, and after 1965 it was diesel only.
The London and Port Stanley Railway was almost the last interurban electric line to run in North America, and as such attracted the attention of rail fans from all over. Al Kerr, a member of the Niagara chapter of the National Railway Historical Association, joined a party of fans from Buffalo who enjoyed a day trip on the line before passenger service was abandoned.
It became more and more obvious that things couldn't go on the way they were, and eventually they made an arrangement with the Canadian National, whereby on the last day of 1965 they simply swapped the line. They traded the whole railway to the Canadian National in return for a nice big chunk of prime real estate in downtown London. And the day the transfer was made, December the 31st, 1965, was also the last day that the electric locomotives operated. With the end of operations, most of the equipment was scrapped. But besides number 8, numbers 10 and 14 are also preserved. They were transferred to the Canadian Railway Museum at Saint-Constant, Quebec, but unfortunately they are not on public show and are not in operation.
A portion of the original LNPS line has been rebuilt and today operates as a year-round tourist line between St. Thomas and Port Stanley. The Port Stanley Terminal Railway, as the operation is called, is run by volunteers who are dedicated to preserving the area's railway heritage.
Number 8 was held by the Ontario government with the idea of putting it into a technology museum, which never developed. And after a while, it was bought by the Ontario Electric Railway Historical Association for operation at the Railway Museum at Milton, Ontario. It was shipped up by Charles Matthews Limited. It was the heaviest car up to that time that the museum had ever got. So we had to separate it, the body and then the 2 trucks, and then reassemble it again out at the museum. And then we had to rebuild it because it was a 1200 volt car and the museum has 600 volt operation. And we had to have the trucks re-gauged because it's standard gauge and the streetcar museum is 1.5 meter gauge. But all this was done, and after 8 years of work, in which the car was restored as closely as possible as we could manage to what it originally looked like in 1915. It's now in regular operation at the museum.
On the wall, very plush, comfy seats, and a nice observation window in the end where you really got a great view of the right-of-way. By the time the cars got to Pond Mills, one of the first stops just south of London, they were usually getting up to a fairly good rate of speed. Curves were very generous, going back to the standards of steam days. So when you were riding a car over this section, you never really knew that you were on a curve. It was so good. The London and Port Stanley Railway had a slight upgrade out of London, about as far south as stop 7, and then it passed an oak tree that marked the summit, and from there was a very gentle downgrade all the way down through St. Thomas, right down to Port Stanley. So that was the easy part of the run, and that's where the cars usually hit their best speeds. South of St. Thomas, there was 6-track yard, fairly substantial for the LNPS, a place called Pinafore. It's sort of a leftover from the days when heavy freights used to come up from Port Stanley with coal traffic and whatnot. It served as a convenient marshalling yard. Just a little beyond Pinafore Yard was another passing siding at stop 22, used occasionally. Not too much by service cars. There weren't those many around during the latter days, but usually if there was a fan trip that just happened to run interference with a service car. There were occasional country roads that crossed on timber bridges, most of which are gone today, of course, or replaced by more substantial structures. These little wooden country bridges were great spots for overviews of the cars, good spots to have run pasts. You could always get a good angle either from the bridge or below at track level. On the day before the last run, a group of us took good advantages of these overbridges to get our last shots of the trains. This was our last opportunity, so we made the most of it. One of the scenic features on the line, of course, was the Kettle Creek Bridge, just as you were approaching St. Thomas from the north. A long trestle. It looks a little spindly, but it could handle all the traffic the LNPS could throw at it. So, of course, the bridge was used to good advantage for many run pasts. There was never a fan trip over the LNPS that didn't use this bridge in one direction or another. And it's still there today, handling Canadian National traffic over their Talbot subdivision. At St. Thomas LNPS station, there was a passing track, a southbound fan trip in this case, passing a northbound regular. The cars 12 and 14 were long cars, excessively long for electric railway service, being about 75.5 feet in length, but very good cars for an excursion. You could pack a lot of people in there. Bear in mind that passenger cars weren't necessarily used just for passenger traffic. They were good heavy haul vehicles as well, not as substantial as a freight motor, of course, but they were used for other duties, hauling express cars or even, on some occasions, hauling a line car. And the line car, of course, didn't have a number. It was always called the line car. The last trestle before Port Stanley was Zavitz Creek, not as high and spectacular as Kettle Creek at St. Thomas, but nevertheless always one that you could rely on for a good run past on any excursion. All the way down the LNPS, you could see the overhead poles. They were characteristic of the LNPS, sort of a triangular lattice work, as contrasted to the type of lattice work steel pole used by other electric railways in southern Ontario. Sometimes on an excursion you could persuade the motorman to go over to the New York Central Depot in St. Thomas, as we did on this occasion when we were celebrating the 100th anniversary of the LNPS, 1856 to 1956. Unlike a lot of other electric railways that repainted the interiors of their cars, the LNPS was nice enough to leave their beautiful varnished woodwork in the cars that still had the stained glass in the upper sash. So it always presented a nice classic appearance. Not old-fashioned, because it was always clean and well looked after. You didn't feel as though you were riding in some antique. Port Stanley was a place where you could always rely on seeing one, two, or more of the tank cars of Sterling Fuels, well known in the Port Stanley and St. Thomas area. They never went much off the Port Stanley, but were certainly a common sight around there. If you were fortunate enough in the summer to be on a regular LNPS car that went down past the station at Port Stanley to the beach, you'd be surprised to find this incline railway, which went from the beach area at the bottom up to a picnic area at the top of the escarpment that overlooked the beach. This thing was built in 1870 by the Great Western Railway and survived till 1966. It actually outlived the London and Port Stanley. The stained glass windows were always a trademark of the London and Port Stanley cars, except for car number 8, of course, which had a fire, and when got rebuilt, the stained glass windows were left out of it. But seen late in the day, the late day light really showed them up to advantage. The passenger service south of St. Thomas had been shut down a month before the total service was discontinued because the substation at St. Thomas had been closed. However, one final excursion was run down on what electricity remained to Port Stanley on the day before the last operation. Rail fans in those days were wearing overcoats and fedoras. Probably all be baseball hats and ski jackets these days. By the time the abandonment notices had been posted in the station windows, service had reduced from 20 trains a day to just 6. And after that, there was a bus service put in which ran from London to St. Thomas and continued to use the railway station for the bus service. On this cold, snowy day, this last excursion was also the last passenger run between Port Stanley and St. Thomas, regular service discontinuing the day after. So, as a final salute, some of the rail fans decided to raise the semaphore there as a final gesture, commemorating the end of service. Because the St. Thomas power station was shut down, we were relying on power to come all the way from London, so this last run up from Port Stanley was really a crawl at times. We're just crossing Highway 4 south of St. Thomas, and of course we got car number 8 in the lead, the one without any stained glass because of its rebuilding after its big fire a year or two before. And of course this car still lives today at the Halton County Radial Railway. The London Port Stanley had maintained an express service for small packages and so on between London and Port Stanley for a number of years. They had a few boxcars of their own they set aside for this purpose. So when passenger service was discontinued, some of the passenger cars continued to be used in this express service for a year or so after. The LNPS was still under contract to pick up and receive and deliver express on behalf of Canadian National Express. So St. Thomas was the transshipment point. The boxcars would be left down there during the day and then picked up later by a couple of electric cars and taken back to London. After the LNPS dieselized, the whole railway and freight operation was handed over to Canadian National. The express service you see here, of course, was given over to trucks. I always looked upon the London and Port Stanley as a standard for what Canadian electric railways could have been had some of their proposed networks really been put together and operated as one large system. It's certainly gratifying to know that today you can still ride that car after 86 years at the Halton County Radial Railway in Milton.